This is Lake Ontario, the easternmost and smallest of the Great Lakes. It is located on the Canada-US border, between upstate New York in its south and the Canadian province of Ontario in its north. But there was a time before both the United States and Canada, and even before the British and the French in North America. The area around modern-day Toronto was once inhabited mainly by First Nation peoples, amongst them the Wendat, also known as the Huron people, and then the Iroquois Confederacy, and lastly the Mississauga. These three groups were predominant at different times, so I want to begin with the first predominant group, the Wendat, known by the French as the Huron people. The Wendat were a confederacy of related nations. Wendat means people of the island or dwellers of the peninsula, referring to their heartland around the southern end of Georgian Bay. They lived in longhouse villages, often surrounded by palisades for defense. A village might have 1,000 to 2,000 people, and each longhouse would shelter extended families, all tied through maternal lines. This means they were matrilineal, or in other words, children belonged to their mother's clan. Their way of life was based around agriculture. They were expert farmers, especially at what they called the Three Sisters, which is corn, beans, and squash, which they grew in large fields around their villages. They were also hunters and fishermen, hunting deer, fishing in the lakes and rivers, and gathering berries and nuts, which supplemented their diet. They were also at the heart of a vast trading network, swapping maize and furs for copper, shells, and eventually European goods. Toronto's trails, like the Carrying Place Trail, were critical to these networks. They believed in a spiritual force that animated all living things. Dreams were especially important, thought to be expressions of the soul's desires. Councils governed their confederacy, with decisions made collectively. Women had powerful roles, including selecting chiefs. They also held large communal feasts and rituals, like the Feast of the Dead, a moving ceremony where remains were gathered and reburied to honor ancestors. In the early 1600s, the French made alliances with the Wendat, exchanging metal tools, cloth, and weapons in exchange for furs. The Wendat quickly became middlemen in the fur trade, controlling access to French goods for nations further inland. But this brought danger too. Diseases. Smallpox and other illnesses devastated Wendat populations who had no immunity. Their role in the fur trade also put them in direct conflict with the Iroquois Confederacy, who sought to dominate trade with the Dutch and English to the south. By the 1640s, waves of disease had reduced their numbers drastically. Then, during the Beaver Wars, the Iroquois launched military campaigns against them. In 1649 to 1650, the Wendat heartland was destroyed. Despite this scattering, the Wendat identity survived, and Wendake today is still a proud community. But they were essentially usurped in their power by the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was an alliance of originally 5 nations: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and they were later joined by a 6th, the Tuscarora. Their homeland was in what's now upstate New York. They called themselves the People of the Longhouse, both literally because their homes were longhouses and metaphorically because their confederacy was like a great longhouse stretching across their territory. They were fiercely organized with a strong council system and powerful warriors. Women also had high status and selected the male chiefs who represented clans at the council fire. In the 17th century, the Iroquois were drawn into European fur trade rivalries. The Dutch and later the English supplied them with firearms, giving them an advantage over rivals. This power fueled the Beaver Wars. in the mid-1600s. They thus expanded west and north, launching campaigns against the Wendat and others. Around 1649 to 1650, they decisively defeated the Wendat Confederacy, scattering survivors and creating a vacuum in southern Ontario, what is today Toronto. After this, they moved into parts of southern Ontario, including the Toronto area, establishing villages and hunting grounds as far as Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay. For a short time, they were the dominant force in the region, controlling trade routes through Toronto's trails and waterways. But their peak didn't last forever. By trying to hold such vast territory beyond their core homelands in upstate New York, they were stretched thin. Southern Ontario was not their ancestral land. It was strategic territory, and that made it harder to hold permanently. The Iroquois also faced fierce resistance from French forces and their indigenous allies, including the Mississauga. Repeated wars through the late 1600s weakened the Iroquois. Like the Wendat, they also suffered from European diseases and warfare. In 1701, there was the Great Peace of Montreal. This treaty marked a turning point. The Iroquois agreed to peace with the French and their allies, which meant pulling back from southern Ontario, including Toronto. So by the early 1700s, the Iroquois had mostly withdrawn from Toronto and southern Ontario. Therefore, the Mississauga, the allies of the French, moved into the region and became the primary nation along the north shore of Lake Ontario, the area in which Toronto is currently. The Iroquois remained powerful in New York State, but they never again controlled the Toronto area the way they did briefly after defeating the Wendat. The Mississauga are part of the larger Anishinaabe people, which include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Their name likely comes from Missasaking, meaning those at the Great River mouth in their language. Originally, they lived further north and west around Lake Superior, but by the late 1600s they migrated south into what's now southern Ontario, moving into the Toronto area after the Iroquois had withdrawn. The reason that they came to the area of southern Ontario was that the Iroquois had pulled back after the wars with the French, and thus there was space for a new tribe to take over. The Mississaugas were part of a broader Anishinaabe movement southward, establishing themselves along the Great Lakes. The Toronto region, with its rivers, forests, and access to Lake Ontario, was rich in resources and a natural gathering place for them. They didn't live in massive permanent towns like the Wendat. Instead, they had seasonal camps, fishing at river mouths in spring, moving inland for hunting in winter, and gathering plants and berries in summer. They used wigwams, made of poles and bark or mats, lighter and more mobile than longhouses. Fishing was central to them. Salmon runs in Toronto's rivers were legendary. They also hunted deer, moose, and waterfowl, and gathered wild rice and berries. Like other Anishinaabe, they were organized into clans, which guided marriage, responsibility, and community roles. By the 1700s, the Mississauga were the main nation on the north shore of Lake Ontario, including Toronto. This meant they were the ones the British dealt with when they wanted land. In 1787, revised in 1805, the British Crown claimed to have bought Toronto land from the Mississauga in the Toronto Purchase, though the deals were fraught with misunderstandings and claimed injustices. The Mississauga later pursued land claims, and in 2010, the Canadian government finally settled with them for compensation. Nevertheless, the Toronto Purchase effectively ended First Nation dominance over southern Ontario.